Good evening. I'm Ezra Cappell, professor of Jewish Studies and English at the College of Charleston, and I'm deeply honored to be moderating tonight's book launch event for the book titled Qorbanot Offering, Poems by Alicia Kaplan and Art by Tobi Aaron Kahn, which was just published by State University of New York Press. And it's so nice to see such a large crowd this evening, all gathered around the warm, comforting glow of your tablets, laptops, and iPhones for stunning art and exquisite poetry. So we may not have the Brie and Chardonnay on Zoom, but what we do have this evening is even better: a gorgeous book, a world-renowned artist, and a brilliant poet. So an event of this sort doesn't just happen on its own, and there are a number of folks that I really wanted to thank at the outset. So first of all, one of my colleagues at the College of Charleston in Jewish Studies, Ms. Kim Browdy, who's our Director of Community Relations in the Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program, for helping make tonight's event such a success. I'd also like to thank my esteemed colleague, Yaron Ayalon, and the director of the Yashik Arnold Jewish Studies program, for enthusiastically agreeing to add this book launch event to our very lengthy semester-long events that we've been having throughout the semester on Zoom throughout this pandemic semester and year. And this is the place where you'll be able to see the archive of tonight's event as well. And I'm sure Kim will put that link up in our chat so you can check out so many of our wonderful events we've been having prior to this evening throughout this semester. So I'd also like to especially thank Raphael Chaikin, who before leaving SUNY Press to become the director of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Press, he served as the acquisitions editor at SUNY, and he was really instrumental in seeing that this remarkable book would be published. And speaking of SUNY Press, I wanted to have a special shout out to James Peltz, who's the associate director and editor-in-chief at SUNY Press, who has made certain that Qorbanot wouldn't just be published, but would be published in such a beautiful edition. And as many of you folks know, academic presses are not usually accustomed to such lavish productions, but SUNY Press has certainly risen to the occasion here. And so the basic structure of tonight's evening will be, I'll briefly introduce our speakers and conduct a very short interview with each of them, with Tobi and Alicia, and then I'll give each of them an opportunity to present their work to us before opening it up for Q&A and for discussion amongst our many people who are here with us this evening on Zoom. So feel free to post your questions and comments for Tobi and Alicia throughout. Doesn't have to be at the end either. You could put them up there on the chat as they come up for you, and Kim will help forward them to me, and we will address them as they come in when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening. So by way of introduction for tonight's event, I just wanted to talk briefly about one of the many beautiful pages of this beautiful book, Qorbanot. And that is, you see, the image I'm going to talk about is on the cover as well. And I'll get to these introductions in just a moment, but I wanted you to see this beautiful image and this beautiful poem by Alicia as well. I just wanted to briefly read it and then talk about the connection, I think, between these two pieces here. And so the poem goes like this. The prayer book my great-grandfather gave my great-grandmother on their anniversary. She had hoped for pearls. The big ruby ring my grandfather sported on his pinky before the war, given to my mother at 18, who wore it with a miniskirt and a red wool sweater. My grandmother's wedding band, lost stuffing a DP camp mattress the day after the ceremony. Her first diamond my grandfather saved up for years. She would have preferred a prayer book. My mother's wedding band, lost down the drain at a Holiday Inn, honeymoon day one. Rubenstein means ruby stone, my mother's name she wishes I wore. Emerald, my birthstone, believed to strengthen memory and give one the ability to foresee. Most often, I wear my grandmother's thimble, find her in the tarnished grooves that protected her thumb from the needle. Heirlooms, offerings, what is passed down from generation to generation, what can be easily contained within objects, and what must pass through blood, coded into our DNA, recessive in one generation, like an unopened prayer book, only to dominate later offspring. How does one acquire tradition? Is it through the blood of Kahn's painting, or is it intuited through a recognition of the great labor of those who have come before us, as Kaplan suggests in her poem? The many truths and revelations contained on each page of this book wound us, and there is no glove to soften the blows or thimble to spare our fingers as we turn the pages of this remarkable book. I think the correspondence on this page between image and text might help all of us on tonight's Zoom begin to understand just what makes Qorbanot so very special an offering. And if you have not yet, by the way, purchased your own copy, you'll definitely want to do so this very evening. And since you're already all on your computers, you're just one click away from the SUNY Press website. So that should just give you a little bit of some insight into what you have coming before us here with Tobi and Alicia. So let me more fully introduce our main speakers this evening. Alicia Kaplan is a poet who splits her time between downtown Toronto and Bella Farms in Hillsburg, Ontario. In the city, she facilitates creative writing workshops with the Toronto Writers Collective, studies in Columbia University narrative. She studied in that medicine program, and she teaches people in healthcare how poetry can help to improve quality of care. On the farm, Alicia grows garlic and flowers, harvests honey and wild plant medicine, and hosts barn dances, which sounds like a pretty good way to spend part of this pandemic year that we've been in. For a decade, Alicia lived in New York, during which she earned a BA at Barnard College and an MFA in poetry at NYU, where she also taught creative writing. And she's held numerous eclectic jobs throughout her life here, and she's received so many different prizes for her work. And as readers of Qorbanot can attest, she enjoys collaborating with musicians and artists of all kinds. Tobi Aaron Kahn is a painter and sculptor whose work has been shown in over 40 solo exhibitions, and whose work he first got renowned when he was showcased and selected as one of the artists in the New Horizons in American Art exhibition at the Guggenheim. And works by Kahn are in major museums, corporate and private collections. And for 30 years, Tobi Kahn has been steadfast in the pursuit of his distinct vision and persistent in his commitment to the redemptive possibilities of art. In paint, stone, and bronze, he has explored the correspondence between the intimate and the monumental. And while his earlier works drew on the tradition of American romantic landscape painting, his more recent pieces reflect his fascination with contemporary science, inspired by micro images of cell formations and satellite photography. And for 3 decades, Kahn has taught at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and he lectures extensively on the importance of visual language and art as healing, a topic we will get to later this evening. And so I'm so pleased to have both of you here with us this evening. My first question this evening is for Tobi Kahn. And Tobi, your work has always been simply signed with your first and last names. And yet for this book, this work, you've added your middle name, Aaron. And can you discuss the significance of this change for us?
So first of all, I want to say, Ezra, we have to thank you beyond belief for doing this. And I want to thank James Young for his foreword, Ezra for your essay, Lori Hope Lefkowitz for yours, and Sasha Pinatel for hers, because Alicia and my work would not be the same without the foreword and the essays. So that's a thank you. And I also just want to say, as you talked about the beautiful color images, that would not have happened without my amazing friend and patron, Ben Post, who really made it happen. Now, I will tell you about my middle name. So Ezra, I don't know if you know this, but I think you do. I'm named for my uncle, whose name was Arthur Aaron Kahn. He was unfortunately the first Jew killed by Hitler in 1933. The little town that my father was born in and my uncle was born in, they now give out this small brochure that talks about my uncle and my aunt, my sister and her son, my cousin, who were all killed. And when I was born, on my birth certificate, it really said Aaron Tobias. And my mother at my bris called my father and said, "Your brother died at the age of 21, so tragically. Can we keep Tobi's Hebrew name, Aaron, your brother's, but when can we call him Tobi Aaron Kahn?" My father said, yes, as long as Tobi really knows who he's named for. And when Alicia and I decided to do this book, I decided my uncle's name should be there because there's not a day that goes by, and I know I don't want to ever talk for Alicia, but our ancestors are so much a part of our life. I wish I'd known my uncle. He was a medical student and an artist. So if you ever look at my passport or my driver's license, or when we bought our apartment, any document I have, his name is on. But this book, for me, is in his honor and memory because he died so tragically young and he was such a fine human being. So I asked Alicia if it was okay with her, and I asked you, and the truth is I just wanted to write our own, but I realized that people wouldn't know that it was my paintings and sculptures. So in my mind, it just says our own.
Well, thank you for that response. And he was studying medicine, wasn't he, when he was killed? And it's really interesting that Alicia, of course, so much of your work in poetry deals with medicine and the ways in which we talked briefly about this, about the way in which art, before when we were getting started before people join us, we were talking briefly about the way in which art can be healing, which is something, of course, that we need now more than ever. And so, Alicia, I was wondering, in thinking about the connections between the art and the poetry, can you tell us a little bit about how this unusual and incredible collaboration between you, a poet, and Tobi Kahn, a painter, how this, an artist, how this got started and how that worked for you?
Sure. It happened rather spontaneously. I've known Tobi for a long time, and we were having brunch one day, and he was asking about my work. I was then working on my graduate thesis at NYU, and I told him I was exploring, just obsessively reading Leviticus, which is not, a weird thing to do, and I'm just so fascinated by the ritual offerings and how physical and kind of gory and tangible it all is, and thinking about ritual a lot. And he said, "Oh, I've been thinking about those same things and making work on those same subjects for decades." And he asked if I wanted to collaborate on something. And as a long time admirer of his work, I immediately said yes. And then we began this process of kind of sharing work back and forth, and I would go to his studio, Long Island City, and we would kind of lay out some of the paintings and then look at the poems and see how they work together. And it was really this back and forth, true collaborative process of forming what then became a whole book.
That sounds wonderful. What an amazing collaboration it is. And it's incredible how each one illuminates the other, right? On each side of the page. I think it works so brilliantly together. So I'm really glad to hear about how that got started, and certainly we see the results of that here. Tobi, Qorbanot, offerings or ritual sacrifice, which Alicia just alluded to. Of course, today we're surrounded by sacrifice and loss all around us. And so how does the original concept that you and Alicia had for this volume change now that it has been released in the midst of the global the COVID pandemic that we're in the midst of?
Ezra, Alicia and I had so many conversations over the years because the book, as you know, takes more than 5 minutes. And both of us feel very strongly of what it feels to be a refugee and coming to this country, and how so many people, whether it's because of COVID or because of the families or communities that they're born into, have to make sacrifices. And it's been over a year since COVID, and we are so lucky in this country that we are able to get vaccines. And what you think about when you see what's happening in India, and you think about tragedies on the border, we are very blessed people that are on this Zoom tonight. And I learned a lot from my children, and our children went to Germany and went back to the town that my uncle came from. And our daughter Maddie has written about the systems of being in jail and what we have to learn how to protect the innocent. And not only protect because of health reasons, but because how you're born and what family you're born into. I can only talk for myself, and I've said this to anyone who knows me, that living through what we're living through now reminds me so much of what happened in Germany from 33 until the end of the war, and how as human beings, we have to advocate not only for ourselves, but for all the people that cannot advocate for themselves, and making sure that anyone that wants a vaccine gets a vaccine. Also, I'm a Kohen, which means I come from the priestly family. And Qorbanot are sacrifices. And as a kid, I don't like seeing blood. And I remember my dad saying to me, and Alicia's written so beautifully about incense offerings and different types of offerings. And I think you have to renew your feeling for caring about humanity every day of your life.
Thank you, Toby. And it's really telling, right? The way you've translated, both of you, Qorbanot, instead of sacrificing, offerings, right? Almost a gift to the world in this way. And I think that both of your responses so far, and of course in the work itself, really exemplify that for all of us who are lucky enough to be here this evening to hear you, and of course to see the paintings and read the beautiful poetry. So Alicia, thinking about the book, the Qorbanot, the sacrifices, and what is left behind, right, or the lost part of that, right, the negative space, the absence of what remains after an offering. I'm wondering if you could speak about how that plays out in your work, right? This absence, the blank space on the page, the line breaks in your poetry, the breadth of each line. How does that play itself out into each poem? And I need to apologize, you are here. I just wanted to get into your work. You, of course, are such a better reader of your poetry than I could ever do. So, but I did want to just start us off. Hopefully we'll get to hear more from you of that in your presentation in a little bit. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that works in your poetry, in the lines and in the absence, in the negative space, or the blank space, as I should say, of the page.
What a great question. I think of the blank space, the white space, not as absence. I think of it as very much a presence, but a quieter one. And so that definitely, as you've noticed, and I appreciate that, is a big part of my poetry, which similar to creating a work of art, I do pay attention to the space of the page and how the words occupy that space and live in that space. And so I think the white space of the page speaks as well as the words on the page do. So that's something I think a lot about. And there's a poem there's a series of vows that run throughout the book at the end of each section. And there's one that's kind of after I talk about my grandparents' experiences in the Holocaust and my, reaction, how it's affected me, where it's just a vow with nothing. There is no poem. It's just the white space that is speaking. And I do think that's because I had Adorno's quote in mind about, you can't create poetry. In a way, sometimes there are no words. And that in and itself speaks volumes. So I think, I think that the part of the power of poetry is it kind of forces you to slow down, and the line breaks, especially reading it aloud, which is always nice for me to hear someone else read my work. It requires you to slow down and to notice the space and to feel it and appreciate it. And so that's definitely, I think, one of the really valuable things about poetry. And then I'll just say, quickly, in terms of offerings and sacrifice, I also, I think of that not as absence, as losing, but as actually an act of creation and connection. And I think we really need that now more than ever, especially this year where so many people are suffering and there has been so much loss.
Yes, absolutely, for sure. And when you were just saying that about so much loss and absence, I couldn't help but think about the breadth, right, of each line, and rereading the book, right, thinking about that and stopping and reflecting on one's breath at each line, right, at each line break, and can't get the images of the people suffering, of course, with the pandemic right now, right, in India, the images that we just see today of people desperate for oxygen, and they need oxygen and they can't get that. So absolutely, it's just, it is something that suffuses as you read through the book, every page now. We can't help, at least I certainly can't, without seeing it and reading it through our current, tragedy that is still raging in other parts of the world, of course, and still amongst us. It's not quite over yet, as we know, of course. So thank you for that. Yeah, and hopefully we'll get to hear some more of the poetry in a little while as well. So this is a question that really for both of you. So having completed this book, and you could take it up one by one or together, however you feel. Do you feel as if you've each sort of reached across the prior boundaries of your art forms to approach the world differently through a new form of expression in many ways? And perhaps this changed, in thinking about what we've been talking about with the pandemic, is what our current fractured world kind of demands of each of us right now, right? In the midst of so much suffering, perhaps we need a new way to respond to the world. And perhaps that is what you've both done in this book here. And so, Tobi, I couldn't help but notice that many of the works in this book seem quite different from your earlier works. And is that perhaps in some way, I know, of course, this book was completed prior to this, but maybe you could talk about some of the reasons for that change and how that, in fact, has some added meaning here now in the time that it has been published.
So these paintings were done. First of all, it was important to me that all the work was on handmade paper, because I felt it was like a skin. And Alicia and I talked about this in the beginning, and these paintings were done over 30 years. Some of them were done when my grandmother died, some done when my mother died, some were done, during Darfur. I mean, these were my go-to meditations. I know Alicia knows this, but I don't know if you do, that 90% of these works have never been seen by anybody. I think Alicia was one of the first people. They were in a special drawer because they were, for me, prayers. They were ways of me getting to deal with grief that I had. And they fit into my other work because I made them with my hands. And I often work on handmade paper. But they were about dealing with loss, dealing with, I just cannot believe what's going on. And they were like, for me, talking to myself. And I told Alicia in the beginning, they were poems for me. I mean, they were ways, I'm not I always laugh that I've been married to Nessa Rappaport, the amazing writer, for 35 years. And I met Lori really through Nessa, but I think in images. I really do. I can't, I talk, it's my second language. I see things and that's how I heal myself. And I've, in the last few years, made so many new works because of what's going on in the world. And I felt lucky that Alicia and I were working on this book because it made me look at 30 years of work and now look at work that I'm doing during COVID. And they relate to these works, but these work are starting points for me. You know, and I have to say again, working with Alicia was profound because she's in her 30s and I'm in my 60s. And you think differently in your 60s. For anyone who's not in their 60s, it's not so bad. I love being in my 60s. And Ezra, I know you have a birthday coming. You're not nearly there, but you're older than Alicia. And this year and a half has been a whole new, I've produced more work in this year and a half on loss and on offerings than I have done in 30 years. And I want to show those works in a different way because this is about, for me, about what Alicia and I did, which was looking at our past. You know, both of us. I don't want to talk for you, Alicia, but this was a lot about my family of heritage and knowing that when I teach in university and I have students who are refugees, I connect to them immediately because I feel what they're feeling. This year and a half has been profound in such a different way because everybody I know is going through it in very different ways, but we all are going through that. Alicia, I'd love to hear what you think.
Sure. Well, so much of what you said rings true for me too. And I remember having conversations with you about, you know, our work as prayers. And I only realized maybe halfway through writing these poems that they were prayers and that I could write my own prayers. And as many of us know, prayer replaced sacrificial offerings. And so that has especially, it has a lot of meaning for this collection. And so I was definitely very inspired by Tobi and his approach to making art and making art as prayer and making, you know, creating his own, not just, you know, the work in this book, but spending time in his studio and spending time with his sculptures as well. And these ritual objects that I had actually, you know, I've had in my home growing up or surrounding me, there was something very empowering in my own individual journey writing these poems throughout the book, but then also in the collaboration and seeing what the meaning that Tobi puts into his work. And yeah, so there, I think another aspect that was especially powerful for me was I'm not the kind of writer who can, you know, be in a cabin isolated for weeks on end by myself writing and feeling inspired. I have realized through this project that I very much thrive on collaboration and I thrive on inspiration from other people. So working with Tobi and spending time with his art was a constant source of inspiration in the creative process itself, you know, beyond an individual painting, but overall I think it really added a kind of creative fuel for me that I've thrived on. So I'm really appreciative to Tobi for that.
Mm. Well, thank you both for those really excellent responses. I think maybe what we'll do now is open up for each of your opportunities now to tell us a little bit more specifically your presentations about your work. And you'll each have about 15 minutes or so Toby, did you want to, I have your slides here, so maybe we'll just start with
Or
you
let
or Alicia.
Alicia, let's Alicia start.
Alicia go for, okay, that's perfect. So
I'm okay with either.
no, that's great. Let's do it.
Boy, Alicia, that was a great idea. I love seeing those faces. What an amazing group of people to be talking to. So Ezra, thank you. And Alicia, thank you.
Yes.
Because there's so many people I know here for, some people for over 40 years. And it means so much to both Alicia and myself that you're here to see what we worked on together.
Yes. So before I get to reading some poems, I want to add my thanks to SUNY Press and Ezra and Raphael for making this book happen, and our brilliant contributors. And again, my wonderful collaborator, Toby. It really has been such an honor to do this project with you. And I'm so grateful that at long last it's out in the world. I'm going to start open with the opening poem in the book. Grain Offering. Am I heretic as I tender to my beloved, seeing no wrong in it? Afternoon prayer, a bed in a field. The root of Qorban is to draw near. All I have to offer is myself. I burn a fistful on the altar. A sweet aroma curls in the air, not rising beyond the date palms. Can I just ask that everybody mute? Thank you. Okay, the next one. After high school, I went to Israel to study in seminary for a year, which was the thing to do. And that was also the year I learned how to question. This poem's about a time two friends and I hopped on a bus in the middle of the night and went to Masada, which is the ancient fortification on the edge of the Judean desert. It's titled Masada Offering. The bus driver dropped us off in the middle of the desert. Nothing in sight but the three of us, 18 years old and running away from Jerusalem, to climb as the sun climbs the fortress. But we couldn't yet see the way. The dark was thick, and when I looked up, my God, I couldn't find the familiar constellations. There were stars upon stars, though everything was still hidden down where we were. So we lay on the sand and feared the creatures that scuttled. Was there howling too? Except Em, she wasn't afraid. Maybe we slept or we talked or not, until the dark thinned, the cliffs appeared. We hiked up the snake path to Jimi Hendrix. B tells me a decade later she was pleased with her song selection. Says in retrospect, we should have been surprised the driver thought it was okay to leave teenage girls in the middle of, but this was Israel, and Jerusalem was more dangerous than desert. There were people there. Despite which we took city buses against our parents' orders. But we didn't think of that. We thought of the wide open sea of sand where no one was watching. We returned to Jerusalem, and we returned to seminary like the good girls we were meant to be. I haven't spoken to Em since that year. She's married with a number of kids and still religious. But B and I are another story, never good at doing good. We're off the path, our parents say. She sends me photos of the black irises we used to visit in the north, and misshapen trees in Tel Aviv, where she lives with a man she can't decide to break up with or marry. And I'm nowhere near. I'm in a valley of California mountains, temporarily. Hiking down a trail that rivers, I remember Masada and wonder why I'm always more afraid of falling during the descent. I return to that night often, though truth is, I can't recall much about it. What I have is the feeling of being released into the wild, the dark and shock of stars, the zigzagging path, and are you experienced? I don't remember coming down, don't remember the sunrise. It was probably beautiful. This next poem is inspired by the book Religious Affects by Donovan O'Shafer, in which he analyzes the chimpanzee waterfall dance that Jane Goodall observed. And he proposes that if we're to understand this dance, we have to consider the possibility that what we call religion might not be predicated on language, which we consider a human attribute, but rather may have a more embodied animalistic origin. Pre-linguistic offering. Chimpanzees dance at the base of a waterfall with, is it not possible, a feeling like awe? Only rarely is a body without weight and shadow. In a word, angelic. You wouldn't think a woman could forget how to dance. If there were no text in temple song, my hips might sway over and above. You wouldn't think a woman could, but I have forgotten what the body is to do upon waking. I would like to be a different kind of lost. To the side, angels are not. Within and without words. Carried on the back of first light. This next one is inspired by Asher Yatzar, which is a blessing you say after you go to the bathroom. Basically thanking God that we have these holes and openings in our bodies, and the right ones stay open, the right ones stay closed. It's actually a really beautiful prayer and one of my favorites. And this one is titled Burnt Offering. What if song entered the mouth instead of leaving it? And what of the sacred nostrils? You say this is not death, but a transformation from one kind of existence to another, a pleasing odor to you. Within me are openings, openings, and hollows, hollows. All that can cross a threshold. Food, seed, waste, incense, ashes, and the skin laps up every touch. There are a lot of questions in this book, as there were in that last poem, and you'll see in this next poem. I've really come to understand that the fullest answers are often questions. I always think of that query someone posed to Dear Abby once. Why do Jews always answer a question with a question? To which she responded, how should they answer? I have always had many questions and issues with Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, and this poem emerged out of that, and out of my deep love and gratitude towards my mother, who was so instrumental in helping me with these poems and throughout the entire process of this book. Offering to my mother. A man left his 4-year-old on the Texas I-20 after nearly choking him to death, as per God's instructions. An Arizona woman tried to drown her toddler in a puddle. Jesus told her to. On what would one day be the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a man bound his adult child, laid him on a pile of wood, knife raised. Offer up your son. Every Rosh Hashanah, I sit in synagogue and hear the story. This is how we begin. This is how we begin. If you ask me, Abraham failed the test. How much sacrifice is too much? When Sarah learned her son had been taken, she screamed 6 times. There is no coming back from the binding and the scarring. I am the child of a woman who didn't have a childhood, but who could blame her parents for not knowing how to comfort after she'd wake crying from a nightmare when their own overwhelmed them. I remember waking up crying after dreaming she died and then yelling at her for overboiling the eggs or something equally trivial. When Abraham and Isaac returned, they found Sarah had let out her last, and where they returned was no home. A body can be a home. My mother had 2 C-sections, and then she had me, who tore her open without intervention. Unlike my forefather, the beloveds I can touch always come before those I can't. Yet, why do we hurt those closest to us? The command to Abraham came from no God of mercy, but of judgment. I blamed my father and his father for passing down the locus of hopelessness, which has made me cold-blooded, most of all to my mother. But these men are no excuse for my wormwood tongue, no excuse. I never once heard her raise her voice. Do we hurt those closest because they will, we trust, always be within reach? My mother believes to be a mother is to protect your child from harm and forgive all your child inflicts. How can I deserve this love? I want to tell her there is a time to suffer in silence and a time to scream. Many of the poems in this book are titled after the sacrifices detailed in Leviticus, like guilt offerings, grain offerings, sin offerings, peace offerings, and burnt offerings. I think my high school Chumash teacher, Mrs. Gamara, would be very proud at how much detail I now know about these offerings, whereas in high school I found it to be quite tedious. But now I'm just totally obsessed. The burnt offering, in Hebrew, the Korban Olah, is also translated as Holocaust offering from the ancient Greek, which I might be butchering this pronunciation, Holocauston, which comes from the words whole and burnt, because the animal is completely consumed by fire. Burnt offering. Her job was to clean the watchtowers. From the windows, she could see the yard, kept pretty with flower beds and rabbits and chickens to pacify the children. She saw the squat, windowless building, its chimney continuously belching black smoke. She smelled the burning bodies, saw the sky turning red. Her name was Judith. Judith, or Judith, was my grandmother. I have her to thank for passing down the writer gene. And this book also explores, as we've touched on, the trauma from the Holocaust that is passed down through generations. So this next poem is about the experience of grandchildren of survivors. And I have my grandmother's voice in my head telling me to turn on more light so people can see me. Dinner table offering. We hate hide and seek, grind our teeth at night, dream about running and running, dream about our parents dying, wonder if we had to choose, whom would we save, scold ourselves when tired or hungry or cold. This is nothing. Think about what our grandfather suffered. We sit facing the door in restaurants, save the smallest bit of leftovers, though our fridges are always full. And though later in life, we will regret not committing to memory every detail, we give each other the here we go again look when our grandmother, during dessert, for the 100th time, in the same voice she uses to describe her trip to the supermarket, tells us how she almost got hanged in Auschwitz for picking wild blackberries. My grandparents lost so much. And most people think of sacrifice in terms of loss, of what one gives up. And as I touched on briefly before, I choose a different definition. I chose to translate Qorbanot as offering. I choose the root of the word korban, which I mentioned in the first poem, and that is to draw near or to draw close. That the act of offering is not about losing, but about creating. And I think of that as primarily creating a relationship or strengthening a relationship, whether that's with God or the earth or a loved one. In the process of writing this book, these offerings, I started out wrestling with a lot of guilt and shame and anger. But through the writing of these poems, these offerings, I was able to come to a place of something like peace and embracing my heritage and knowing that I can create my own offerings and rituals by focusing on offering as that act of drawing close, of building relationship. And despite what she'd been through, my grandma focused on creation, not loss, whether that was by sewing, cooking, storytelling, making new family rituals. She had an amazing love of and respect for all of humanity and nature, down to the littlest birds. I thank her for passing some of that down to me. And I thank all of you for being here and sharing in our celebration. I will finish with this poem, Offering of 10 Dresses. One American soldier found her an old sewing machine and blue and white checkered linens from abandoned SS barracks. She cut up the cloth on which Nazis had slept and sweated. She sewed. May 5th, 1945, the first photograph in years. 2 rows of young women, fleshed, returned to their faces in matching gingham dresses with puffed sleeves, collars descending into perfect points, pattern elegantly diagonal there on the breast pockets. At her kitchen table, a plate of rugelach between us, she points to the photograph. We began, Mamale, to be human. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I think I share so many people's comments in the chat with thanking you so much for that beautiful reading. Very powerful, very moving. And hopefully you'll get to read afterwards all the chat, the beautiful comments that people are making throughout as you're reading, Alicia. So thank you so much for that. I think we'll turn to Toby, who wanted to share some slides of some of his work. So let me screen share with you all.
As you start, I'm seeing Alicia's truly amazing mother here. And everything, Alicia, you wrote about your mother is true. She's one of the most exceptional people I've ever met. And your poetry, I've read it all, obviously, but hearing it from your mouth was so profound. I mean, I love what people wrote. There were so many things you said that are so true of anyone who's a Holocaust survivor's descendant. My best friend in the world, who I've known since I'm 15, is Dr. Mark Tikachinsky. And our kids laugh. I've known him since we were children. And one day there was a problem, and he said to me, Toby, you know, if I have one loaf of bread, you have the other half. And I repeated that to our children. And they said, you guys are so who you are. I mean, like, who says that? And I say, his dad went through, he was on the trains to be just, I totally understand. And when you wrote what you said, Alicia, and you said it so profoundly, I think of everyone I grew up with. Until I was 18 years old, I did not know one person who was not a child of Holocaust survivors. I grew up in Washington Heights. My first language was German. And when I hear you read, I believe it's the survivor that has to remember the people that are lost. And I pray that this book helps do that. And there's survivors in all different ways. You and I come from a particular way of surviving, but there's so many people in the world that are surviving from different things. And I believe, and that's why I hope this book and exhibition goes to many university campuses, because the particular becomes the universal. And when I heard you read, I thought of that again. So the cover image, I was thrilled. I wanted that as the cover. And I'm thrilled that Alicia agreed. And when I saw that poem of hers, it was obvious that that was the right way, because blood is so many different things. Blood is what keeps us all alive. And without it, we can't live. But in sacrifice and in offerings, there's a lot of blood. And I wanted to show images that didn't scare you, but made you think. And I realize now that poetry adds a whole other dimension, because I've learned from my amazing wife that not everyone sees right away visually. And sometimes they need a way in. And once they get that way in, they have their own narrative. And all these images to me are visual touchstones to bringing you, the viewer, to understanding the world we live in. And I believe, as I always have, I believe in Tselem Elokim. We are made in the image of God. And every human being has a reason for existing. As my amazing patron, Jane Blaffer Owen, told me when I first met her 30 years ago, she was a very religious Christian. And she said to me, God gave you a gift. Your hands are your key to creating, but your soul makes the work. And all these works tonight that you're seeing, I believe were ways for me to let you as the viewer understand why I think it's so important to live, why it's so important to try and heal, and why you should never sit back and say, what can I do? I'm just one person. You are one person, and that one person should help heal the world. So let's go to the first image. So some of the work is more obvious. I am not going to be Where's Waldo and explain the imagery, but I will tell you, as I told Alicia when we talked, my choice of paper, my choice of color, my choice of imagery, my choice of narrativeness or less narrative were important to each piece. And it was very, very hard for me to pick only 12 images, because as Alicia's poems, every one, you should get the book, because every image and every poem tell another story. But I wanted to go back 30 years when I was closer to Alicia's age than I am to my age. And I wanted the paper to be very fragile. All the work in the show is made on handmade paper from India. And I remember when I bought my first pack 40 years ago, I bought a lot of it. And the person in India wrote me back a note and say, I'm so sorry, Professor Kahn, this work is not exactly the same. I think we can do better. And I wrote back and I said, if you make it exactly the same, I'll stop buying it. Because the paper would tell me what image should be on the paper. And I've learned, I studied, with students of Joseph Albers, and I believe in color theory. And sometimes, I'm not sure you know this, but black and white are not colors. I always laugh that people talk about things being black and white. It's not a color, it's a value. And I wanted the first image I showed tonight to be a value and show the importance of what it means to feel lonely and what it feels to feel that you don't know what's going to happen next. I have to also say that every name of my work is thanks to my wife, Nessa Rappaport, because early on I would write Untitled. And Nessa helped me find ways. I would tell her, this is living in Manhattan, I'm sorry, the noise. Every name is based on a story that I would tell Nessa, and she would help me come up with letters, and that's why they're all capitals, to tell you that story, but let you be the narrator, not me telling you what you should see. Let's go to the next one. Just 2 years later, I started hearing about famine. I mean, I always knew about famine, but I would read more and more in the papers about what it meant for people to just want seeds, what it meant that every morsel that one had was a treasure. And in Judaism, blue is techelet. And I wanted this piece to have a lot of techelet. Now you would say to me, Toby, how do you know what techelet is? And I'd said, well, I don't, but there are two different people in Israel that decided that techelet was either from a snail or from a fish. And I loved, they both were at our house for Shabbat, and they told me how the other one was wrong. So I wanted not one blue in here, I wanted two blues in here, and I wanted a golden color that related to food and work that came from the ground. And Alicia, again, I've been at that farm, and knowing what you grow and your mother grows is so powerful for me as a Jew, that we're taking honey and garlic and all these different things, and we are growing it for ourselves. Let's go to the next one. Now you'll see some of the images are a bit more joyful. We're going to get to the ones later, because I think when I was younger, I still saw things very bleakly. I mean, not all my work. You'll know my work during that time. And these are not, I was doing landscape painting, very much based on the romantic American landscape. But these were when I was talking to myself and saying, how can we possibly make the world better? And how, as an artist, should I make images that talk to that? There's a part of me that's very happy that I have not shown this work for as long as I did, because when I look back at them, I'm back in that moment when I made them. And there's a very famous story about Picasso, that he did the blue period and the pink period and different periods. People thought they were over a short period of time. And it turns out that one of the writers for a show at MoMA talked about the fact that he re-entered his feelings at different times. And I don't think the images in this book would have been as strong as if I had done them in 1 or 2 years. They needed time to grow. They needed time to be honest. And the most important thing for me, I needed the security to show work that was so close to my heart, that didn't look like everything else I was doing now. And I again want to thank my ancestors, and especially my aunt and uncle. I see my sisters here who lives in Israel, and we have always talked about the fact they both died so tragically, and I want to be a beacon for them, and not only for them, but for anybody else who goes through suffering. Let's go to the next. Now this one, I told Alicia right away, I know one image that has to be in the book, because when she talked about the Akedah, not everyone thinks about that poor animal and what was sacrificed at the end. And that many times animal sacrifices are there in lieu of us. And I won't talk too much about this, but this is one of those images when I heard about how terribly animals were treated in slaughterhouses. And one of my students, how I always thank, I feel blessed that I'm a teacher, and I've learned more from my students than I have from any of my other artist friends. And she showed me all these pictures of animals being pushed together and that they were born to be killed. And again, the background color is another techelet, but that blood is as close to what I can see as blood of sacrifice and the blood of these tragic animals that were breeded just to be killed. Let's go to the next one. Again, you'll see this is again much more interior. And this started when one of my close friends told me that she had tried to have children many times, and she unfortunately had many miscarriages. And I've always been fascinated, and I've always taken images of our 3 children in utero with Nessa. I'm not making a political statement. I'm talking about Tobi Kahn. I believe it's a woman's right. Men should keep their mouths shut about women's right to have children and what they do. And even my Rebbe is here, Rabbi Saul Berman. And when a woman is trying to have a child is very different than in other situations. But this was an image that I was shown of a woman who had a miscarriage, and she had twins. And I will never forget that image, because to me, it also looked like a face, but it's almost literal for the image of these pre-children that she wanted so badly that never existed. And I wanted to make an image that talked to that. Let's go to the next. You know what? This is so personal to me. I want you to look at it for my minute that I have, because it tells so much about humanity. And I pray that if you heard Alicia's poems and you look at my images, but I'm talking about really looking, not just saying, I like it, I don't like it, what is he trying to say? It's about you as the viewer, what I hope you're getting. Just know one thing, it's very important that the green is repeated twice and the white is repeated twice. Let's go to the next. So, my mother's death was the hardest thing I had to come to grips with, because she died very quickly. She had pancreatic cancer, and while she was in the hospital for 6 weeks, I cared a lot about making flowers because she loved flowers. I also realized my mother always said, life is a journey, and you don't get to choose how you're born and how you leave the world. And I believe so strongly in Tselem Elokim, that we are all in the image of God, and that you have a heart that's not necessarily in the shape of what we look at as a human heart. And after she died, I did many images because I'm a Kohen and I could never go to a cemetery. She was the first time I went to a cemetery. And I realized that even though I said in the beginning, black and white are not colors, there is something very powerful in metallic color. And that color in the background is not black, it's metallic. And if you know something about metallic, it shines and it picks up the color of who's there. And I believe my mother gave that to her 2 children and anyone she met. Let's go to the next. These are done much later. And as you can tell, the images become more complicated. I also have learned that total sorrow should not only be sorrow, that you should learn, as Alicia said about her grandmother, that you should look to the future. I'm going to go to the rest of the images quickly because I am a German Jew and I will not go over my time limit. Let's go to the next. I think, Ezra, is this the last image? No, there's another one. So this one related so much to Alicia's poem. Read this poem and look at this image because I like what Alicia did with this image more than what I originally conceived of it. I want you to know, Alicia and I would go back and forth and sometimes she'd say, I really want this image for this poem. And I'd say to her, but Alicia, you know that what I did with this poem was not necessarily based on this, but I love what you said. And I want it to be a partner with this. So as I talk to you about the images, I hope you realize that is not something that I'm saying, it's not relating to Alicia's poems, because all of art relates on many different levels. And I pray that all of you take from Alicia's poems and take from my images what you bring to the experience, because she and I are only two people. Let's go to the last image. I think this is, no, there's another one. We're going to go on because I'm watching my time. So this is when I start bringing color. This is in the last 18 years. And you can see I'm revisiting certain ideas, but they're much more uplifting about birth and life. Keep going, because I'm not going to be unfair. I think that's the last one. And Alicia and I wanted to think about offerings as awful as something joyful. And I really thank Alicia. I showed her many images and she said, that's the one. And once she said it, I went, I want this one to be one of the last images in the book, because I believe, like my mother, we're on a journey and we should learn from every experience we have and bring light to the world. Ezra, back to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Toby, for that beautiful presentation. And I think for those of us who haven't yet read the whole book, you could begin to see the connections and the way in which the art brings out the poetry and the poetry brings out the art, and how they work really together in such a powerful way. And you know, once you've seen them and read it together, it's almost impossible to pull them apart, right? I think about it, and after you finish a page, like they're both working on so many different levels in your mind, right? An after image of the words and the images and the colors all together. It's such a powerful experience. So, so thank you both for that. We have plenty. It looks like we have a lot of questions here in the chat. So we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And let's see. Many of these are just comments on the beauty of your poetry, Alicia, and the beauty of your paintings, Toby. Let's see about some questions here. Are there questions here? A lot of great comments. Let's see. We have, okay. So one question is for Alicia, that are any of these poems ekphrasic, right? Inspired by one of Toby's works? Instead of matching them together, is there one that you created as a result of one of these paintings?
I think there might only be one that was directly, you know, Toby sent me a batch of paintings, and I saw one which is the painting that is paired with the the last poem in the book, Offering in the Holy of Holies. And I saw that and I said, this needs to be in it. I need a poem for this. And so that one inspired the final poem in the book, actually. Other ones, I think it was more not a direct, yes, that beautiful, beautiful painting. Others weren't so much a direct ekphrastic poem, and they weren't, you know, in the traditional sense, not a poem describing the painting, but they work together in a different way, which was very cool for me to witness, and I hope for everyone who encounters the book to experience just the way that the words and the paintings interact with one another. So it was a different kind of inspirational process in writing the poems and pairing them with the paintings.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, those work so well together. Beautiful. Thank you. Questions, a lot of great comments. Hopefully, again, you guys will be able to go back and read this once this is all archived to see all the wonderful comments that people are making here. But questions for our artist and poet here. We have a few minutes to respond to questions you might have.
Don't be shy. Alicia and I are both, I think, nice people. There's no such thing as a bad question. So please don't be shy. Ezra, do you have anything to ask us?
I do. Well, I think, I had a question for you about you talked about the handmade paper that you use for this. And to me, it seems, I did see them at your studio, and to me, it looked like it was almost on vellum, right? On parchment of some sort. And I'm wondering what that says about our holy text. And I think for each of you are talking about, you know, the prayers, right, that Alicia was writing as she's writing these poems, almost like meditations and prayers for herself. And of course, you mentioned earlier, Alicia, and Tobi as well, that of course, prayer itself is a replacement for, after the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, prayer supplanted, right, since there's no more animal sacrifice, which is, you know, for those of us in the 21st century, right, who are more conscious of animal cruelty, as you spoke of earlier, Tobi, that is a good thing. So I was wondering what is the import of that, right? The importance of the paper being almost like parchment, and how that works in terms of holiness, of creating something lasting, something ritualistic almost, in terms of your other work.
So early in my career, I thought about being a sofer. And I'm not sure if you know this, but if you write parchment, you write prayers, you have to always be in a good place mentally. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. I'm not that good a person. I try to be, but I then bought some parchment and tried to paint directly on there, even though it's exorbitantly expensive. And I didn't like the way the paint sat on the surface. I never felt it became one. And then again, one of my students told me, because we were talking about paper, and they said, why don't you work on handmade paper? And I went, wow. So I went to a store called New York Central. The owner I knew for years. He's not alive anymore. He was Jewish. And I said to him, what's like parchment that's a handmade paper that is not really perfect? And he said, everyone wants perfect. I said, well, I don't. And he gave me 7 types of paper. One of them came from India. And the minute I saw it, I knew that's the only paper I want to work on for the rest of my life. And I've been doing it now for close to 35 or 38 years. Hmm. And the reason I like it so much is I really believe it speaks to me, and it starts the conversation. And each paper that you get is a different weight and a different edge. And some have blemishes on them. And I love that. I like that the non-purity is what makes it so holy to me.
Mhm.
When Alicia and I started working on this, I had done some paintings, but I said to her, I only wanted to be these. I don't know if you remember this, Alicia. I was taking out the pages and I said, well, that painting works here too. And I said, but I only want it to be on handmade paper. And then we talked about the fact, and Ezra, you know this, and Lori knows this too. We want the readings and the exhibition to go to multiple universities around the country. And if it weren't for COVID, it would have started already. But I want them to be able to travel where the traveling is not an expense. Moving paintings around is very different than moving small paper pieces around.
Mhm.
And I felt Alicia's poems deserved handmade paper.
They certainly do. And we have a question for Alicia here, which has to do with really great question. This is quite a sophisticated audience here. And so this question comes from David Epstein. He's saying, does sound relate to language as shape to color?
Wow, love that.
Yeah.
Might
I
have
know
to
that
sleep
is.
on
That's
that,
brilliant.
think about that one and get back to you tomorrow. But I think so. Though shape, I mean, the page, the poem does have shape too. So in a way, sound, maybe when the poem is spoken aloud, it gives a certain shape to it in a similar way that a painting does. And I think speaking poetry aloud is such an important part of the poetic experience. So I recommend when people are reading the book, even if you're alone, read out loud to yourself so you can experience the shape of the poem.
And I want to add one thing to Alicia. Finish reading the poem, read it out loud, and spend the same amount of time as you read the poem to look at the image. I'm not a dictatorial artist. And I love seeing Rochelle Rubinstein in the middle, who also happens to be a breathtakingly talented artist, and her partner in life, who's another very talented artist. But art should be looked at and looked at and looked at, just like a poem should be read slowly and read aloud.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. Jerry, I think Samet had a question.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see you after all these years and to hear these resonances of my family, of your mother and your grandmother. I think the poems and the artworks work together beautifully, and that's really what prompts my question. Alicia, you grew up with gifted visual artists, and Tobi, you've lived your life with a very talented writer. Have you ever, on your own, tried to pair the two media?
Well, I don't know if you know this, Ness and I have collaborated on many, many things together, besides our 3 children, who I'm very happy are all here, who are truly amazing people in their own right. But I learned from Nessa, and I know that her and Rochelle have such a tight bond. I believe people are given a gift by God of something. I don't think most people, I mean, I know Alicia does beautiful artwork too, but most people are given a skill. And I love working with people that are given the same level of skill as I feel I have in creating artworks. Alicia, I'd love to hear, since he's your relative and he knows your family, I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I only realized I do create art too, and I have realized in the last few years that I can collaborate with myself. So that's been something I've been exploring. And then I have done collaborations with my talented mother, Rochelle. We have done some book projects and window installations and guerrilla art. And I really look forward to doing more. And I do think we inherited some of that from her parents and my grandmother. Yeah, when I was 10, I asked for sewing lessons and a sewing machine. My grandmother taught me to sew, and sewing is a part of my mom's artwork too. So we definitely have some of her threading through our work, and feels like collaborating with her in spirit.
So funny that you say that, Alicia. My sister's here from Jerusalem was a poet, and she and I have collaborated as well.
Okay, well, we have a few other questions here. Maybe we have a couple of minutes left. This has been such a great conversation here. So first of all, there was a question about how long, this is for both of Alicia and Tobi, how long did it take to develop the book altogether? I was trying to figure that out as reading it. Maybe you guys remember the answer to that for sure.
I looked back to figure out when it was, and I think it was the end of 2015, I think.
I have notes from you from, yes, it was that long.
Yeah.
And then we were looking for the right person. And I remember telling Alicia a few years in, we got to get Ezra Cappell. We got to get Ezra Cappell. He'll get the poetry and the art.
Yeah. So it's been a while. It's been a long time in the making, which I know I feel especially grateful that it's finally out, and it feels like the right time.
That's wonderful.
By the way, I agree with that, Ezra. I think this is the perfect time for the book because of COVID and the world. I wish it was a better world, but since it's not, at least Qorbanot can hopefully help heal something.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a really great question. And these questions have been really wonderful. I'm sorry if I've missed any of them because they're coming in now rather fast. Deborah David asked, she writes, the idea of Qorbanot in the Bible is as much about repentance as it is about sacrifice. Were you trying to connect these ideas? Are these pieces about a rebirth or reset? And did you feel this in the way you created your work? The themes are very serious and sacrifices can be harsh, and yet your work inspires forgiveness and life.
Wow. First of all, I'm thrilled that Deborah's here. She was a student of mine in high school. So, but Alicia, I'd love you to start because I'd love to say something, but I know you and I have discussed this so intensely, and I love what you've told me. So you start and I'll continue.
I want to know what I've told you. I don't remember.
Oh, I'll tell you what you told me. You said to me, when I won't mention the poet's name, we had talked to about maybe having, well, we wanted his opinion. I now don't see if you remember this. And he said how harsh Leviticus was. And you and I both said, we both went to day school. I studied in yeshiva in Israel afterwards for 3 more years, but you know a ton, Alicia, and I'm proud to collaborate with somebody who knows so much. But you and I don't feel Leviticus is only about harshness. And I have many Christian friends who always say to me, in fact, I talked to one of them today, and if he's online, I love you, but I do not think the Old Testament is only, as he said, is pure harshness. I do believe that our book is about everything. And Deborah, thank you for bringing that up, because there are sacrifices that help you cleanse yourself. And if you know about the paraduma, the red heifer, and about being a Kohen, which I am, you should Google that because it's an amazing story. But I do believe there's redemptiveness here. And I think you and I both wanted that in this book. Am I speaking for you in the wrong way?
No, not at all. To add to that, well, not only is sacrifice in the Bible, in particular the book of Leviticus, seen as very harsh um, as Deborah said, but also boring. You know, the books that have the stories are the ones that are most well known. But I came to reading Vayikra, Leviticus, and for the first time, I was really able to appreciate the poetry and the strangeness of the language. I had never really related to the Bible, the Torah, in that way before, and I had a lot of anger and resentment and guilt associated with it. But I came to reading about these sacrifices, and they are definitely harsh. They're definitely very bloody and visceral. But there's power in that too. And I think for me, part of well, first of all, and there are a couple of really great books out there. Leviticus as Literature, and Leanne Feldman just wrote a book about, like, we're looking at Leviticus as actually a work of great literature, and it does really interesting narrative things. But in terms of the actual descriptions of these sacrifices, what I got from that is a real appreciation of the value of life. And I'm not advocating to, go out and start slaughtering animals, but I do think we have lost something by not having, most of us, unless there's some farmers and butchers out there on the Zoom, I don't know, but not having that direct experience of witnessing an animal dying and its life being taken, and that it is witnessing that moment of offering that life, of offering that blood. The way that makes one appreciate life is powerful. And for me, that's what I really get from these descriptions of sacrifices in the Torah. So that to me it's harsh, but it's really life-giving in a way too.
Well, I think we'll have to wrap it up on that note. That was really such a beautiful conversation, Alicia, hearing you read your poems and talking about so many different aspects of the work and how they fit with the paintings, and Tobi talking about the artwork and how it fits with the poetry and how together this is art that in poetry and words that are truly healing. And I do hope that everyone on the Zoom tonight has an opportunity to go and purchase the book. You can go directly to the SUNY Press website. We would have a book signing if not for the pandemic here, but hopefully this is the kind of show that the paintings and the poetry that we could take on the road and go to different towns and college towns, as Tobi and Alicia have said, and visit other places and bring the transportable works of art that Tobi has created on that handmade paper as well. So we look forward to that moving forward, and that this book should have a very long and fruitful life here with this wonderful and beautiful collaboration. So we really thank everyone for joining us this evening, and you could find the archive of the program right on the Jewish Studies events page, which I think Kim has put into the chat here, as well as the link to SUNY Press if you would like to purchase it directly through them. And I apologize for so many of these questions. There's so many great questions that we couldn't get to. So hopefully you'll have opportunities to ask Alicia and Tobi those questions in other venues or through their websites for sure. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer those questions that we didn't get to this evening. So thank you all for joining, and thank you both, especially Alicia and Tobi. Yes.
Ezra, I just want to say, you should read Ezra's work. He's an amazing writer. He's not only an excellent moderator, but he's really smart.
Kim, can you mute this person talking now? I think.
No. And I want to say a funny story before we end.
No.
I met Alicia many years ago, but I also met you, Ezra. And I still remember having a museum exhibition in El Paso, Texas.
Yes.
And they told me there, I think this is 20 years ago,
yeah,
there's another Jew here. Maybe you'll know him. And I went like, this is ridiculous. I met Ezra and we both spent summers in Tannersville. And Ezra, you went with me into the mountains so I could make paintings based on rocks.
Yes.
You have been the most supportive friend to artists. And what you did tonight, and I got 3 different texts from people saying, Ezra Cappell is an amazing moderator. And Ezra, you are. And
Okay.
Kim, thank you for the work you did. And this will go live and you can see the post.
Yes.
Alicia, thank you again. And I want to thank Rochelle for being the amazing human being that you are, because I never would have met Alicia without you. And I know that my wife, Nessa, I never speak for my partner in life, but I know she thinks you're a goddess, and you are. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Everyone.